Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining in on our webinar this afternoon on Understanding the New Mathematics Australian Curriculum version 9.0. My name is Kim Keane and I'm the State Manager for Queensland for Cambridge University Press. Before I make a start, in the spirit of reconciliation, Cambridge University Press and Assessment acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So that you're aware, this webinar will be recorded and you'll receive a link to this recording along with a feedback link for you to offer feedback on your experience this evening. You can expect to see this arrive in your inbox within the next week or so. Please ask questions in the chat box, which we'll be monitoring throughout the webinar, or we will be having a Q&A session following David's presentation today. I'll be detailing publication, sampling dates and product pricing at the end of the webinar, so stay tuned if you're interested in that. But let me introduce David Greenwood's the Head of Maths at Trinity Grammar School in Melbourne and has more than 30 years experience teaching mathematics from years 7 through to 12. He's the lead author for the Cambridge Essential series and has authored more than 80 titles for the Australian curriculum and for the syllabuses of other states. He specialises in analysing curriculum and the sequencing of course content for school mathematics courses. He also has an interest in the use of technology for the teaching of mathematics. Welcome, please, David Greenwood.
Hi, Kim. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks everyone for coming along. And also in the background there, I think we have Scott Halligan from Cambridge University Press as the publisher of our current series and new series next year. So thanks, Scott, for coming along and helping with some of the questions. Yeah, very excited to receive the 9th version of the Australian curriculum, and I hope to be able to provide a snapshot of that for you, covering things like what's new in the Australian curriculum, some of the new key content, talking about the pathways, the optional pathways which replace the 10A curriculum, a little about the algorithms and technology content descriptors that are distributed amongst the curriculum 7 to 10. Modelling and First Nations perspectives are also new emphasis in the new curriculum, and I'll also talk about some of the ways that Cambridge have responded to these changes in the Australian curriculum. All right, so let's just get started. So just from the outset, I'd like to mention that one of the overall structural changes of the curriculum is that the key strands, the 3 strands, number and algebra, measurement and geometry, and probability and statistics, have been replaced with the obvious 6 separate strands, with geometry being rebadged as space. So 6 separate major strands rather than having the 3 with the combined ones mentioned earlier. You can see with this image that there's a document where you can see these strands being organised, F to 10, version 9.0. You can easily find this on the web. And obviously we've been spending some time working with the 7 to 10 curriculum. This is an image of the old curriculum where you might remember that the major subject strands, like number and algebra, were divided into substrands called, say, patterns and algebra or linear and non-linear relations. But these minor substrands have been removed and all the content descriptors are now just organised into the 6 major content strands. So that's an image of the old curriculum, and this is an image of the new one, where, for example, we have the number strand with the content descriptor on the left, and all the content descriptors for that year level are in the left column. If you do, check out the document, and on the right-hand side, you'll have the corresponding elaborations. Now, just a note on the elaborations. Remember, these are good suggestions, but not necessarily a course or a comprehensive list of what should be taught corresponding to those content descriptors. So you can see the wording there is this may involve students doing these things. So the elaborations are there, but they're not necessarily a full course to be followed. So there are plenty of other great suggestions that you can come up with to meet those content descriptors of the new Australian curriculum, a little bit like the old one. Okay, so what's changed in the new Australian curriculum? Well, obviously the content descriptors have changed. There have been some changes to the content, and I will go over those shortly. And we have refined elaborations with an emphasis on a range of things, including investigation and modelling. It's certainly something that's more obvious in the new Australian curriculum. Technology and algorithms is something that's new, and also First Nations perspective, which we will talk a little bit about later as well. Okay, looking at year 7, if you do have a closer look at the new Australian curriculum and compare the old with the new, here's a short summary of what you'll notice in year 7. So place value with expanded notation is now explicit. Manipulating formulas is a new content descriptor in the algebra section. Volume of triangular prisms is new for measurement strand. A little bit more work on circles, pi and circumference, which used to be in year 8, is now being introduced at the year 7 level. More on statistical investigations and probability simulations, which lead quite nicely into some algorithms. And there's a specific algorithmic thinking content descriptor in the space strand. So they are the main content features that have been added to the year 7 Australian curriculum compared to the old. Looking at year 8 now, we have these new content descriptors, more on financial applications and linear modelling. Pythagoras has been strengthened and is certainly part of the core now, rather than being something that school might treat as extension. A little bit on algorithms, also in the space content descriptor, and simulations and statistics, again, has also been strengthened. There's a little bit in year 9 as well. There's small work on irrational numbers, introduction to surds. There's more depth in expanding and factorizing, and more on quadratic equations and their graphs. Using technology, there are descriptors on errors and algorithms, and more in statistics looking at sampling methods and data displays. And again, simulations come up for the 3rd time, which could potentially link quite nicely to doing some work with algorithms. Now in year 10, there is a specific descriptor on errors in measurement and number. So dealing with errors and accumulating errors in measurement calculations, for example, that is its own descriptor. Exponential relations and graphs used to be part of the 10A curriculum, but has now been inserted into the core. And there are 2 new descriptors there to look at in algebra, A03 and A04. There's a descriptor for technology and graphing. Now, logarithmic scales, there used to be some work with logarithms and log laws in 10A, but logarithmic scales has now been added to the core content in year 10. Not going as far as logarithms and inverses and laws, but more interpretation of scales and graphs has been included. Modelling is there. Now there's a new descriptor on networks, which is interesting because that really hasn't featured in previous Australian curriculum documents. So networks dealing with trails and circuits and weighted diagrams, for example, looking at problems in that field, and also more on statistical investigations. So that's the new year 10 content in the core. Now, you'd be interested to know that some of the 10A content has been deleted, and then some new optional pathways have been inserted.
His image needs to be moved now.
So one of the things that has been removed, I believe, are the extension areas of trigonometry, looking at the sine rule, cosine rule, and area rules for triangles. In measurement, pyramids, cones, and spheres are not in the 10A curriculum anymore, are not listed. Graphs of circles and hyperbolas, I don't believe, are listed as well. And the work that we used to do, or some of us used to do in our extension classes on polynomials, is no longer listed in the 10A sections of the new curriculum, which is not called 10A, but it's called optional pathways. other 10A content has been carried forward. So I'm not going to list all the 10A content that used to be taught, but if it's not listed on this page or the previous page, then it has been carried forward through to the new optional pathways. Scott, did you want to add something on the deleted 10A content?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize at this point that what we're talking about here is content that has been deleted from the Year 10 10A curriculum, and not necessarily what has been removed from our textbook itself. We've tried to have a very pragmatic approach to some of this kind of content that used to be called 10A, and lots of schools will run classes with various names. Pre-methods is a common name for this kind of thing. And we've tried to be conscious of the needs of schools who are doing those kinds of classes. So whether it is in or out of the curriculum, we have, as we've done before in previous editions, made our own decisions about what makes the most sense to have in a particular textbook at a particular year level, including for the purposes of preparing students for those calculus-based classes in year 11 and 12.
Thank you, Scott. And I think anyone teaching an advanced class in year 10 measurement, for example, would just love to keep some material on pyramids and cones and spheres, for example. So those topics won't be completely removed from the Cambridge resources. Now, there are some new optional content topics that have been added. There is a descriptor on solving simple trigonometry equations, which has caused us to add a section to year 10. And as well as networks as being a fairly significant addition to the core, in the optional content, we have counting principles, including factorial notation, selections and permutations, as well as some applications of counting techniques to probability problems. So that has resulted in a number of sections at Cambridge where we've looked at the principles, selections, arrangements, and as well, as I mentioned, the applications to probability. So that's a significant addition to the more advanced elements of the Year 10 Australian curriculum. All right, moving on. Now, just if you did want to look up all of those things that I've been mentioning over the last few slides, so looking at what is new, what has been deleted, and what has been refined, you'll find a document with this title, the Comparative Information Document. And it's quite useful, actually. On the left, you'll see the new curriculum, the description of how it compares to the old curriculum and the corresponding 8.4 version of the Australian curriculum on the right-hand side. So that is something worth looking up in terms of planning for your courses for next year. And there is a more visible version of what I just mentioned. Okay, now I just wanted to mention this again because the word algorithm does come up. If you do a bit of a search on the new Australian curriculum from 7 to 10, you'll find that the word algorithm comes up 26 times. And so this is worth noting, and it's certainly something that at Cambridge we've noted and tried to respond to. There are 87 references to the word model, which is interesting. So that's something we've thought about as well, and also 30 references to the words First Nations. And so this has led to us thinking a little bit about how Cambridge is going to respond to the new Australian curriculum. Before I talk about those features, though, I do want to mention what are some of the key features that Cambridge do intend on keeping, and we believe are quite popular. And so we won't be throwing everything out before delivering a new text for the Australian curriculum, because some of these features have been kept, including the proficiency strand grouping. And this is where the questions in the exercises have been grouped according to the proficiency strands in mathematics, fluency, problem solving, and reasoning. And that combines with the enrichment questions that are available in every exercise, and also the building understanding questions that have been grouped and added to the introductory sections of the text in each section just after the key ideas, which could be used as a teaching tool. You'll notice we're keeping our 3 different differentiated learning pathways through each exercise so we have an easy, a medium and more challenging selection of problems through those proficiency strands. So every student, depending on their level, will have at least a few questions from all of the different proficiency strands. Scott, did you want to mention something about those as well?
Yeah, just to emphasize that this is one of the things that, you know, in summaries about what has changed in version 9.0 of the Australian Curriculum for Maths, one of the first dot points that is included in those summaries is to emphasize that the proficiency strands are as a type of lens through which you can look at the curriculum as a whole, that is no longer part of the of version 9.0, and instead understanding, fluency, problem solving, reasoning are part of the content descriptions. Instead, they are part of the wording of specific content descriptions. So I just wanted to mention that although that there has been that change, we still have to have ways of asking questions in exercises about the curriculum content, and whether understanding, problem solving, fluency, etc., are part of a larger framework, a lens or an axis through which to look at the curriculum as a whole, or whether the wording is being placed in specific content descriptors. It made the most sense to retain this structure in the exercises. Not just from a pedagogical point of view, or just analyzing what the meaning is of the change for the new Australian curriculum, but because of what is a practical approach in the classroom, and also as a way of grading questions and using the working programs that David mentioned, the particular form of differentiation that we have that David's showing here. So for all of those reasons, that is why we've retained the structure of the exercises like we have. And in a moment, David will talk about some of the other changes to the more minor changes to the exercise structure that we've made. But broadly, that grouping of questions in those categories with a large form grading from easier to harder is still the best way for us to approach the exercises.
Thank you very much. One of the other features we do want to keep is our progress quiz, which is situated about halfway through the chapter and could potentially be used as a formative assessment tool. And hopefully one of our goals is to have students studying for the unit of work right through the topic over the 3 or 4 weeks, and not just studying the night before the test. And so having a progress quiz available for students halfway through the topic has been quite a useful tool. And I believe that the progress quiz is available in the text. It's also available as a downloadable printable worksheet, and also as an auto-marked assessment piece on the Cambridge digital tool. So that's the progress quiz. And another thing that we do like to print and have available as part of our resources is the applications and problem solving pages, where there's a double page spread with 3 extended response style application questions that will help students apply what they've learned from the chapter up until that point. And that's situated about 3/4 of the way through the topic. So students have some practice at applying what they've learned in a real context before they're getting to sort of something like a test or a similar piece of assessment at the end of the unit of work. New to the previous editions were our learning intentions, and these will be retained and refined for the new editions. They help provide a link to the curriculum documentation. We think they help teachers plan and lay out their lessons. and make connections to the success criteria of that particular lesson. And there's the success criteria, which have also been refined. These are situated towards the end of the unit and have a specific example listed against each success criteria. And those examples will have answers this time round, and they'll be available inside the text, I believe. Now, with the mention of the word modelling being referenced 70 or 80 times in the new Australian curriculum, we felt it was important to refine and enhance our modelling activities on top of the applications and problem-solving sections that I mentioned earlier. So these modelling activities were, in fact, new to the last editions of the Australian curriculum Cambridge text, where we have one activity per chapter, and it's scaffolded in such a way that students and staff are not thrown in the deep end, if you like, where there are preliminary tasks to warm students up to an activity and provide some kind of background, and then a modelling task working through the different sections of the task with a modelling rubric, if you like, which you'd be all familiar with, and that includes a formulation section, a solving section, evaluating and verifying section, and a communication section. And the idea being that students would be able to complete this task and come up with a structure that would be able to produce a nicely constructed report in a modelling context. Another feature that we're going to retain, as been fairly popular, is the now you try questions that are situated after all of the examples. And these are questions, problems that are very, very similar to the existing examples. And this is something that teachers may wish to use after working through the examples and perhaps the corresponding video. They may wish to try these ones instead, which are somewhat similar, and have students do their own solutions to these problems. It could work quite well with a flipped learning model, or it could work quite well at the start of the class if teachers are wanting students to try something just after they've listened or worked through an example that the teacher has led. Now, the word algorithm was mentioned earlier, and Cambridge does, in fact, have a whole chapter available for our users this time round on algorithmic thinking. And there's a range of resources which we've produced here, but the algorithmic thinking that was largely inspired by some of the content descriptors of the Victorian curriculum have created a unit of work where teachers can now look at a couple of activities from 7 through to 10. And this chapter will be made available as a digital resource for the new Australian curriculum. Just as a quick example, there are a range of activities covering the different content strands for algorithmic thinking. As an example, in Year 7, there's an activity on adding consecutive numbers using Excel. In geometry, we're using some simple code and turtle graphics to create shapes. And in probability and statistics, there's work with Excel and the use of random numbers for finding the mean and generating patterns. There's a couple of sample snips from those sections. You can see with the turtle graphics, students are using repeats to create multiple hexagons. And that idea of repeating is something that corresponds quite nicely with algorithmic thinking and would lead to students perhaps potentially down the track doing some coding and using some for loops and so forth. But the way we've treated this is such that students will do very simple things with Excel and maybe turtle graphics and flowcharts and so forth to be introduced to the idea of algorithmic thinking. In Year 8, we use flowcharts for divisibility tests. There's some examples of maximizing and minimizing using Excel and some very simple pseudocode for sorting data. In Year 9, again, Excel and flowcharts are fantastic tools for algorithmic thinking and so on and so forth. And also in Year 10, there's a range of activities in this digital chapter for people to use. Now, as well as that digital chapter, we did decide that with the word algorithm being so popular in the new Australian curriculum, we wanted to make this area of work quite accessible to students. And so we decided to come up with an activity for each chapter right across the series. So there's 40 activities from 7 to 10. And we designed a range of activities that correspond to the new Australian curriculum descriptors. These activities are a little bit like the modelling activities, are there and organised in such a way. So there's a starting point, part 1, where students get started with a very simple activity, introducing them to the idea of solving an algorithmic type problem with say flowcharts or Excel or something like that. They might be applying an algorithm, they might be following an ordered list of instructions, they might be using flowcharts or another type of repeated process. They'd also be using technology like spreadsheets, dynamic geometry, like Desmos, for example, or they might be using graphing calculators, or even at a higher level, some level of pseudocode. And as well as providing this activity, we wanted to make sure that students had the opportunity to extend what they've done. So each of these activities have an extension section where they can adjust parameters or look into the problem in more depth, or even build a much more complex algorithm.
David,
now with the first,
David, sorry, David, could you just go back a little bit to the, that's fine. Yeah, I just wanted to bring up a few things. First of all, just a question for you. Do you want to talk a little bit about you've mentioned this a little bit, but I think it's worth emphasizing the range of technology that will be covered by these activities, and why we've chosen certain types of technology for different topics?
Yeah, certainly. We found ourselves gravitating towards technology that was obviously free to use and reasonably familiar to most people. So this is where spreadsheets came in a big way. A great tool for students to be writing tasks for simple algorithms, using formulas, filling down, adjusting numbers to home in on an answer. A great tool for algorithmic type problems, like maximizing the area of a rectangle with certain conditions on the perimeter, for example. Easy to use, no need to have a background in code, for example, to be able to do these types of problems. Another one, dynamic geometry, very intuitive, to be able to follow an algorithm in an ordered way to build a construction. Again, technology that's easy to use, that anyone can pick up following the instructions. Flowcharts are obviously quite useful in the study of algorithms, and so we've used those throughout many of these activities as well.
And everything that you've mentioned there gets to the heart of the fact that these activities are about computational thinking. They are maths activities. This is a new part of the Australian curriculum, obviously, is something that we've seen in Victoria before, but it's new to the Australian curriculum. So I think that for anyone who has not taught this kind of thing before, these will be very accessible. The technology chosen for each activity makes them accessible. They're very sensible choices. And in some ways, the algorithms and the notion of computational thinking and so on are in the background, and the activity just sort of completes itself in some ways. You don't have to specifically worry about too much about teaching your kids how to code or anything like that in order to get the most out of these activities. Having said all of that, David, though, maybe just very briefly, could you give an introduction in 30 seconds or so as to what pseudocode is and where it might be found in the new series.
Yep. So pseudocode is a language. It's sort of a universally accepted language in English with some common symbols and words that really anyone could understand without too much knowledge of a particular language in coding. And it's a way of describing an algorithm that could be coded up in a particular language. And that's where it sort of provides a bridge, if you like, between mathematics and a problem that might be solved using computational thinking and the world of programming. But where we're coming from is building those skills with solving problems that are of the style where computational thinking is involved, and being able to think this way without really having to know too much about the code itself.
Yeah, thanks, David.
All right, so moving on to the First Nations perspective, what I have here is just two examples of the content descriptors relating to First Nations perspective in the Australian curriculum. And Cambridge has responded by thinking about these content descriptors and how we could incorporate that into our resources, including a range of investigations. Right, Scott?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the ways we will be approaching this new content in the curriculum, which are found in the elaborations, 29 or 30 elaborations throughout the 7 to 10 curriculum. The main way we'll be approaching this is by writing investigations that will be fun to do and informative, and students will get a lot out of them. We think we won't be providing an investigation on a particular elaboration, but there are elaborations that talk a lot about investigating certain things as per the couple of dot points that David showed earlier. They'll cover a range of types of mathematics. So there'll be investigations that range across a few different content strands: space, measurement, statistics, and so on, where it makes sense. So that the investigations have a lot of mathematical meat to them, as well as dealing with the cultural, historical aspects of the curriculum as it's been included in those elaborations. So we'll have more to say on these closer to publication date, but we're proud of them as they stand at the moment, and yeah, we'll be able to show some samples relatively soon.
Thank you. Just more specifically on new sections, obviously responding to the new Australian curriculum, there were areas that we needed to address specifically. Sometimes we felt that our existing sections or extension sections already addressed some of the new Australian curriculum content descriptors, but there were other areas that we needed to address. So here's some examples. 7, we've done some work with ratios, and that has been strengthened slightly to correspond to the refinement in the Australian curriculum with regard to ratios at Year 7. You might remember I mentioned the volume of triangular prisms, and the work with circles and circumference is new at Year 7. So we have written new sections there. There's actually a new section relating to 3D coordinates, as well as some work on inequalities and a little bit of work with Pythagoras at Year 8. At Year 9, new sections relating to errors in measurement and sampling in statistics. And a little bit more work, more significant work in Year 10. Obviously, you'd expect a range of sections. I think there are 4 new sections dealing with networks and logarithmic scales. There are 4 sections that I mentioned earlier relating to counting techniques or combinatorics, percentiles, and two-way tables. So these are some of the new sections that we are putting in Year 7 right through to 10. to accommodate those changes. Now, Year 7, I'm going to mention quickly, has 10 chapters. You might remember, for anyone who's been using the previous Australian curriculum textbooks, we used to have 11 chapters in Year 7, but we've brought that back to 10 by combining the geometry chapters. There used to be 2, but now there are 1, just to make it a bit easier for teachers to fit the curriculum into their year and to address the new Australian curriculum. The order is retained, however, in the other chapters, which is good, and the Year 8 and 9 order and the number of chapters has been retained. Now, for Year 10, there have been a number of changes, obviously, Year 10, with the networks and the combinatorics and those other sections I mentioned. So there's been a little bit of a change there. The Australian curriculum optional content, there's been a significant change, and we have reacted to those things. And as a result, some reordering was sensible at Year 10. And just as one example here that you can see there, we've actually made a new chapter 10 called Polynomials, Functions and Graphs, because all those elements that we wanted to keep in the series from the old 10A, like functions, introducing polynomials, that's no longer in the optional pathway, graphs of circles and so on, it made sense to put all those things together, and that is the new chapter 10, and that had some impact on the other chapters as well. There were some more logical groupings, for example, with the strengthening of logarithms in the core Year 10 curriculum, it made sense for exponentials and logs to now become its own unit of work. So those are the types of things that we've been doing at Year 10, and we look forward to presenting the chapter order to you. And we're quite excited about how that could be implemented in schools. One of the things we did spend some time on, with COVID in mind and with many students struggling at this point in time to try to get back up into Years 7, 8, 9 and 10, we did make some refinements, especially early on in the exercises, so that every exercise has a very simple starting point and a starting point that has a very close relationship with the examples that's linked. That's something we have spent quite a bit of time working on to make sure that those problems don't come about. Of course, all the digital material that corresponds to these new sections and the refined older sections have been updated, like the worksheets and tests, all the quizzes and the videos that correspond to each of the examples will all be updated to suit, of course. One of the new features we're quite excited about is something that might look a little bit old-fashioned, but teachers were asking for it, and that is a printable skill sheet for every lesson. Because often teachers would like something to do at the end of the lesson to test their basic skills and the things they've learnt from a particular lesson, or they may wish to have a 5 or 10 minute quiz at the start of the next lesson, which might follow up yesterday's work. And so a 1-page, perhaps 2-side skill sheet has been authored for each exercise right across the series. One of the other new features we're quite proud about is the PowerPoint slides, where all the learning intentions and the lesson start and all the material before the exercise will be presented together in PowerPoint form. So if teachers did want to use the PowerPoint presentation technique to present some material, they could use this resource to do that.
David, I might jump in here just to say that one of the motivations for us putting these PowerPoint slides together is we know that a lot of teachers are doing this kind of thing already by themselves, by meticulously screen grabbing parts of the textbook and placing them into their own documents for the purposes of their classroom teaching in a way that takes hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, time that they could better be spending doing other things or just having a break. So this is something that we'll be doing for the next edition, the PowerPoints will be editable, so you can delete material if you'd like to. But that's something we will be providing, so that if you're already doing something like that, you won't have to do it yourself.
All right, thank you. And then one of the other tools that, Scott, you'll help me talk a little bit about is the new diagnostic tool, which has been a couple of years in the making now, I believe, but it's been an opportunity for us to really enhance our diagnostic tools corresponding to our resources and being linked with not just our resources, but the new Australian curriculum as well.
Yeah, exactly right. And this is another thing that a lot of schools around Australia were using Cambridge content for, for want of a better term, homemade diagnostic assessment systems, which frequently included gigantic spreadsheets of data that teachers had to key in themselves. We are, as David said, we've been working on this the last couple of years, and we're pretty proud of what we have built. As David has listed there, it's something that is very closely aligned with the textbooks, and there'll be one of the advantages. I think there's some more slides, David. One of the advantages of what we've done is build it so that teachers, schools will be able to create diagnostic assessment tests to suit whatever model that they are currently using, if they're using one, regardless of the type of testing or the frequency of testing that they do throughout a unit of learning. You'll be able to build them using either the structure of the new curriculum, if that's what you'd like to do, just by working through the curriculum content descriptors, or by just going through the sections of the textbook as you're teaching the content itself and building these diagnostic tests that way. There's a great deal of reporting that is connected to it. As David mentions there, we've broken down the curriculum and the textbook content into the smallest, what we feel is the smallest usable unit of content, which we call mathematical skills. And for each of those skills, as David has written there are 5 questions, 2 easy, 2 medium, and 2 a little bit harder. As I've said, there's going to be a lot of powerful reporting connected to this, around 10,000 questions across the series, and it'll be powerful, it'll be easier to use, and hopefully fairly seamless to use in connection with the teaching that you're already doing, meaning this will not be some add-on that you'll have to sort of separate from the rest of your teaching to try and force into a program. It will go hand in hand with the program that you already use.
And I might add there,
Scott, more to
Scott,
say about that?
Yeah, I was just thinking if teachers want a diagnostic test based on their unit of work, which may correspond, it may or may not correspond to the textbook, but if it is, then they'll be able to select and filter in such a way that they'll have questions that correspond directly to the units of work and as topic sections that correspond to the text. But if they wish to have a diagnostic test that corresponds more to the Australian curriculum content descriptors, then they'll have the ability to create a test very easily along those lines as well.
Yeah, exactly right. And the mathematical skills that when you see this content, Kim and the other Cambridge reps, when you see them, invite them out to your school, they'll be able to get into detail about this. But it is a fairly big and comprehensive program that is, if you book list or choose to use Cambridge at your school, this is not something that will be an add-on product that you'll need to purchase. It'll just come with the suite of teacher resources that's part of the system. and David showing a few additional slides there. So that's something that this diagnostic system is too big to cover in detail in this presentation, but it's something that we'll be able to show in other presentations, and in particular when the reps come out to your school.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. Well, I think that comes to the end of my slides, and perhaps we might have a little bit of time for some questions now, if there are any to address.
Yeah, there's one topic that has come up a few times, David. One in the context of a request for us to do Year 5 and 6 textbooks. But more generally, perhaps you could talk a little bit about how the series aims to account as much as we can. I mean, we aren't these are resources. They aren't things that can teach students themselves. But to the extent that we can account for that in Year 7, how does Year 7 bridge the gap of learning that schools might encounter when they have kids coming from primary school into Year 7? So what kind of revision content is there? How do we approach differentiation at Year 7 in particular?
Yeah, at a number of levels, I guess. The choice of lessons in Year 7 is carefully selected, I guess, because we wanted to make sure we're picking up on all those key skills that students should bring from junior school up into the secondary school. So those sections have been carefully chosen, but there's also a range of sections which we've titled as consolidating, and these sections relate directly to Australian curriculum content of Years 5 and 6, and are regarded by Cambridge and the authors as being super important. And so we felt we really needed to have those sections in there at Year 7, as well as those that are not titled consolidated or extending, which are the sections which correspond to the core Australian curriculum. And then, as well as that, to have the extending sections as well, because we know that schools wish to have a range of pathways for students of different abilities. So as well as having those differentiated learning platforms or pathways through each exercise that we talked about earlier, we've also have those extending sections and the consolidating sections, which teachers could choose to teach or not, to open up those different pathways for different learning abilities across the school.
Yep. I might get you, David, to talk a little bit about the way that a section works now. I don't know that this is something that you necessarily have a particular slide for, sort of covered in a range of slides, but perhaps you could talk a little bit about the flow of learning that is intended to happen via the way that each lesson has been structured, starting with the introduction, going to the lesson starter, and then so on and so forth, and then how the worked examples connect with the questions in the exercise.
Yeah, so after the introduction, every section has a lesson starter, and this is a short activity that teachers might wish to use as a bit of an icebreaker, if you like, for the lesson before they get into the more formal examples. We have a small section near the examples and after the key ideas, which is called Building Understanding. And we used to have those in the exercise, but we felt that they were perhaps more useful with feedback that we had from teachers as more of a learning tool that teachers could use as an activity without necessarily asking students to write something down every single time like they would in an exercise. So that works very closely with the key ideas, which is obviously a summary of what's expected to be learnt or taught in the section. And then with the use of the examples and the attached videos and the Now You Tries, there's a real opportunity there for teachers to use those as a teaching tool, or for students to learn themselves at home if they wanted to, by rewatching videos or having a go at the Now You Try questions. And then with the exercise, as I mentioned earlier, we have organised those exercises according to the proficiency strands with their own level of grading within those strands, so that the strongest and the weakest students can have something to try within each of the strands. And then at various points, there are the connections made with the examples. So if students want to link off to the examples for some assistance, as well as looking at answers or even fully worked solutions, then there's that help provided for students if they're working from home, for example.
I might take the opportunity to talk a little bit about how what you've just described links to the diagnostic assessment tools that we were talking about earlier, and that is as well as the diagnostics itself, and the reporting connected to the diagnostics, which will allow teachers to create Goodman charts, and the data will be exportable. There'll be a range of reports that are designed to show student growth across the unit of learning, or across any period of time where you're testing on common content. One of the things that we are focusing on is follow-up work, meaning in particular that if the diagnostics is showing that a student or a group of students or a class are struggling with a particular mathematical skill or a particular topic, built into the system will be methods for you to set them follow-up work that is designed to help them address those gaps. And the way that the diagnostic questions are so closely connected with the textbook in different ways means that there is a very close link between certain questions and worked examples and worked example videos, and now you try questions, recommendations for particular questions in the exercises, and so on. So there will be a type of communication that is available within the system from the teacher to the student that will allow teachers to direct students to activities from the textbook, the interactive textbook, and so on, to help them address those gaps. And one of the principles that has guided us along the path as we've been building this is to try and help teachers encourage students to take ownership of their own learning, which is, I know, something that is something that teachers try to do anyway, and this will help facilitate that. So, students taking ownership and taking the initiative to do a certain type of homework, and that applies to all abilities as well. So if the diagnostic assessment shows a lower ability student that is has certain gaps, then they will have follow-up work available to be set for them. But the same thing with higher achieving students as well. If there's even if they are performing at level, so to speak, or above level, there still may be things that they could improve on, and follow-up work can be sent to them as well to address or improve on their performance as well. So I guess the point of saying all of that was to emphasize that follow-up work is an important part of this diagnostic assessment tool, but is allowable because of the close, the way that we've thought about the tool and the textbooks as one resource that works hand in hand. All right, I'll just take a look at a couple of more questions, David, but anything you want to add to that?
No, that's okay. If there are any more questions, otherwise we can switch over to Kim fairly soon as well. But I'm sure if there are any other questions that we don't answer during this webinar, we'd be very happy to get back to those people in due course.
Well, one more, and this is not necessarily something for you, David, but I'm just trying to find the question here. Let's see, from Peter about when content has been moved from one year to another, will you allow your new version of the text to allow access to that topic across both years, as it could be missed in their transition? I mean, I'll say that the authors have tried to preempt that as much as possible in the writing of the new books, but that is a good point, and it's something we'll think about. We'll discuss with the rep for your particular school if that's something that is really needed for your school. But David, is anything you want to add to that about how we're managing the transition of topics that used to be in 1 year level but is now in a different year level?
Yes, it's often the case though with topics that from 1 year to the next, we might develop it in 1 year, but in the following year we usually do a review. And through the Cambridge series, I'm pretty sure we are doing that all the way through the section. So for example, if year 7 we're doing volume of triangular prisms, it doesn't mean that it's not in there at year 8 as well. So if you're looking at year 8, you will definitely find a follow-up section on volume of prisms, and that would include the volume of triangular prisms. And the same goes for other topics like looking at circles at year 7. As year 7 will focus more on circumference and then development of the idea of pi. And then at year 8, that will be followed up and perhaps repeated to some degree, but then rise to a higher level, looking at more complex problems with circumference and areas of circles. So I think the idea and what we've tried to do is develop that transition through so that it's a grading right through the series and there's no big gaps or jumps between content.
I think we had, just to clarify something, Amy Gilbert, you asked the question, is there a chance that this diagnostic tool will be available for the senior textbooks too? The answer is not specifically. There'll be, depending on what state you are in and what syllabus or senior curriculum you do in your state, there are a range of people from across Australia here in this presentation today. So it will depend on exactly what state you're in, but we do have a new tool for senior mathematics subjects as well that we're starting to roll out, beginning in Victoria and Western Australia for their senior subjects, and that has aspects of diagnostics in it, but it is more designed for exam preparation, not specifically diagnostics. There is a fairly big difference in the purpose of diagnostics for year 7 to 10 and below, compared to the kind of goals that students might have in their senior years. So something that is similar but is built quite differently and has a different purpose to what we've been talking about today.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. So I might stop sharing now and pass over to Kim if you want to prepare your slides. That'd be great.
Thank you. Yes,
Yes, we can, Kim.
Yes.
Great. Excellent. So really the question that we're receiving from everyone is availability, of course. And I have great news that we can start with at least the digital sample, and we're expecting the year 10 digital sample tomorrow. So you'll get an email as soon as it's available with a link to that, and you'll be able to check that out. So that comes first. I thought that was really the best way to tackle it initially, because it's really—
Sorry, Kim, hang on 1 second. There are a few messages from people here saying that they can't actually see your slides.
Okay, thank you. So,
okay, someone's saying now we can. Okay,
perfect. Cool. Good. There we go. So now I've got all of the dates up on the screen. And so, like I said, the year 10 will be coming out first for the digital sample, followed by the year 7. So we're going to start with that first, and then you'll see some page proofs come through digitally, and the same thing will happen. You'll have that in a link that you'll be able to be supplied with. Publishing dates, though, they are the year 10 coming out first. You can expect that in September, followed by year 7. and then year 9 in October, and finally the year 8, which is coming out in November. So it's the same arrangement, year levels that the sampling will come out to, and the page proofs. But most importantly, you'll have something that you can look at and really have a nice play around with, hopefully by tomorrow for the year 10. So I'm looking forward to being able to, really share something with people then. Sorry, Scott, were you about to say something? No?
No, I wasn't. I don't know if you could see my face. Maybe my lips were moving as I was typing or something like that. But no, please.
That's fine. So pricing is all pretty normal. No big changes here. $72.95 for the print digital. Digital code staying the same, $59.95, and of course our teaching suite at $149.95. And just a little spread of some faces here, myself and Annie are the Queensland team, and Emma Kapler. I took this little framework directly off our website so that it looked a bit pretty, but Anna Borrowdale, who's also our sales and marketing director, she is also available if you have any other questions, and nobody else is available there. That is who's also there as well. Really, that's everything that I had, certainly in terms of extra material. Hopefully tomorrow everyone will see that link come through in their emails. And please, if you've got any questions, reach out to your consultant, and we'll get back to you with any information that we do have as soon as it comes around. And we're just really excited to get something out to everybody. Thank you so much, David, as always, and Scott, of course, for everything that you add to all of the material we have, along with webinars and workshops included. It's great to have you on board every time. So thank you, everybody, for coming along this evening. It's always a wonderful thing to share these fantastic products with everybody, and we're very thankful to have you all using Cambridge, and hopefully more of you in the future. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.